So the final section of this class is going to focus on the role of the international community, whether we're thinking about sort of international organizations like the UN or NATO or the African Union, or whether we're talking about NGOs or other, I guess, individual actors. Occasionally you get the Pope intervening in conflicts as a mediator, but various different actors that get involved in conflicts in theory with the goal of trying to bring about some sort of resolution. And we'll kind of talk through some of these in greater detail, but today I'd like to kind of lay out the wide range of types of ways that the international community or outside states, outside actors play a role in interstate conflicts, civil wars, and similar kinds of violence. And so I'll begin with maybe the broadest category. I'm not actually sure that that's true. Intervention, which can cover sort of direct military action. You're sending in troops, you're actively bombing, you're participating in the conflict in a direct way. But could also include indirect military intervention. So you're providing guns and cash. It could involve, providing intelligence support to help with making a state or a rebel group's military more effective. Military training would also fall under that. Or it could be more indirect or non-military kinds of intervention that we'll talk about with sanctions and other kinds of economic support or diplomatic support. But typically when we're talking about intervention, we're talking about something that is targeting the authority structures of a state. So simply, sending in money to a conflict, to help with refugee resettlement or to help with economic development isn't necessarily on its face intervention. It's only intervention if it's affecting the conflict and the sort of core of the conflict around who's in control, the government or the rebel groups, and trying to alter the outcome of that conflict in some way, shape, or form. So the intervention is either supporting the government and holding the government in place, or it's trying to undercut the government, maybe directly supporting rebels. But that's sort of the critical piece. The intervention is about the conflict in some way. People who really drill into this, and for my dissertation project I had to, will note that intervention can't just be sort of you're doing a particular thing that happens to be helping. The concept of intervention implies a break with what you had been doing before. And so if you're always providing military assistance to a country and you've been doing it for 30 years and suddenly there's a civil war in that country, you continuing to provide military assistance isn't necessarily an intervention. You're just doing what you were doing because that's what you do. Stopping that military assistance, now that might be considered an intervention. That would be a change from the status quo that's designed to impact the conflict and maybe in this case weaken the government. And so there's that element of convention breaking, of changing what you're doing. And we see intervention taking place at various different phases across the conflict, but primarily sort of during the initial sort of escalation phase, or once the conflict is sort of in full swing, or maybe there's a stalemate and you're trying to break that stalemate. It tends to come on the sort of military side rather than the conflict resolution side. When we see outside actors involved in the conflict resolution side, we'll talk about that in different ways as something other than a military intervention. So there's also economic interventions. Typically we would describe these as sanctions, where you're trying to disrupt primarily the economic activity related to one of the actors. Sometimes these things can be broadly targeted at a state, and so you're putting an embargo on sale of guns into a state, or you're restricting trade. Currently, with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the international community has responded with some targeted sanctions going after critical components that Russia would need to rebuild its military hardware and to keep supplying its forces. So those sanctions are going at the entire country, saying you're not supposed to trade these particular kinds of items to Russia. Sometimes you have embargoes against goods that are being exported from a country. Those can certainly work, but I think in the last 20 or 30 years, there's been a shift away from those sort of broad sanctions that affect an entire country or an entire society, and focusing more on more targeted sanctions that are going after specific industries, specific companies or firms, specific individuals, whether that's trying to undercut them and their ability to get access to a critical resource, whether that's freezing bank accounts or denying them financing, whether that's restricting travel. And so it could be that you go after the leadership of a state and try to make it difficult for them to move about, difficult for them to squirrel away money. Maybe you freeze the money that they've already squirreled away. Those are kind of things that you can do to apply pressure specifically at the individuals who are making decisions, hopefully shifting their calculus as it relates to that conflict. And sanctions can get used at pretty much any phase of a conflict, whether we're talking about sort of the escalation phase or the de-escalation phase and the conflict resolution phase. You get economic tools and levers being used by sort of outside actors to try to affect these things. Diplomatic pressure is also a way that states and broader sort of international cooperative organizations like the United Nations can push for some sort of resolution in a conflict, or can potentially affect a conflict. This was my dissertation project where I looked at U.S. diplomatic signals that on the face didn't necessarily have any sort of material impact, right? The U.S. says a nice thing about the government, or the U.S. criticizes the government, again, verbally, not, sending cash or guns or bombs, and trying to look to understand how this was affecting the strategic calculus of leaders involved in these conflicts. And what I found is that when there was a high probability that the United States might intervene, that those diplomatic signals seem to matter a lot, and they seem to work where positive statements supporting the government dramatically shortened conflicts, and statements critical of the government dramatically lengthened conflicts. And I was able to drill down and find a couple different mechanisms that intensified that pattern. But one of the things I found really interesting when I started investigating why that was the case is it seems that when the United States sends signals that are supportive of the government, where the U.S. is likely to intervene, rebels interpret that and say, you know what, if we continue pushing, if we are nearly successful in overthrowing the government, there's a good chance the United States is going to intervene and stop us. And so they tack for the negotiation table, and you get a conflict resolving more quickly. When the United States is less likely to do that because they're sending negative signals, that maybe emboldens rebels to continue pushing to overthrow the government, and that ends up leading to more protracted conflicts. And so there's, at least I've assembled, and I believe there's pretty compelling evidence that the diplomatic messages that are being passed around these conflicts are actually meaningful and are actually influencing how different actors, rebels, governments, whatever, are responding and thinking about how they should continue with their conflict, what kinds of strategies might be acceptable, what kinds of strategies might be effective, what's likely to be a red line that's going to complicate things for them, and how to navigate that environment. We can talk about mediation. Mediation is involvement by a third party, just like we've been talking about with intervention. But in the case of mediation, the third party is not taking an active role in the conflict, trying to influence it one way or another. They're not fighting or supporting one side, at least not militarily or in a significant way. Instead, that third party is there as a facilitating actor to help parties reach conflict resolution. In theory, mediators bring to the table their reputations for honesty and trustworthiness, and that's what makes them effective. There's a lot of debate in the political science research about this, about whether being a trusted mediator is important, or whether being a biased mediator who has resources that you can bring to bear is important. And we'll drill into a lot of that as we go. But the whole basis of the idea of mediation is that the parties involved in the conflict really do want to get to a settlement. That's what they want, but they can't get there on their own. Maybe there's a lack of trust. Maybe they need some sort of political cover, but for whatever reason, there's something that's blocking them from being able to sit down and actually negotiate and work out a solution. And so the role of the mediator is to come in and sort of remove one of those stumbling blocks to sort of make that resolution process work in a way that the parties couldn't reach on their own by simply negotiating. And so we see mediation playing out in a lot of conflicts. The international community has yellow pages, or I guess white pages, phone books, basically, of mediators who have been trained and who have worked in conflicts and can be called upon to support conflict resolution. Okay, peacekeeping is one of these that we're also going to spend a lot of time talking about. Peacekeeping ends up being incredibly important for stabilizing conflicts as they approach a conflict resolution phase. And peacekeepers can do a whole host of things. Sometimes they're just sort of there as monitors, binoculars in a jeep and driving around, sort of confirming that yes, the ceasefire is still holding. Sometimes they're involved in disarmament. They're collecting weapons and maybe getting them out of circulation. Sometimes they're involved in basic policing, right? Essentially working as beat cops and helping to provide some local security. And occasionally, peacekeepers get involved in sort of actively suppressing violence, actively stopping one party from breaking a ceasefire or violating the terms of a peace agreement. We'll be talking a lot about sort of why peacekeeping works, but the short version is that during a period of demobilization and disarmament, pulling back from the front, that's a moment of incredible vulnerability for actors, conflict participants, states, and rebels, that if they engage in good faith in disarmament and demobilization, and their adversary doesn't, that could potentially leave them vulnerable. And if their adversary betrays them and takes that disarmament and demobilization as an opportunity to gain territory or to smash them, they're going to be in a really bad place. But peacekeepers sort of help stabilize that and reduce that fear, because there's a sense of my adversary isn't intending that, otherwise they wouldn't have agreed to bringing peacekeepers in. And certainly they will pay a huge cost if they try to reignite the conflict over the top of those peacekeepers. And so it creates a level of assurance that the plan that was worked out for how to bring a conflict to an end will actually be implemented, and you're not leaving yourself vulnerable. Or at least if you're leaving yourself vulnerable, you have some assurance that vulnerability won't be exploited by your adversary. Again, we're going to talk about peacekeeping in a lot more detail in a subsequent conversation, but we're just kind of getting the foundations laid here today. So the international community also plays a role in capacity building, trying to get states coming out of conflict to be able to function, to be able to operate, to be able to support their populations. And so this can be everything from training bureaucrats, and providing them with the kind of equipment that they need, typewriters, computers, filing cabinets, the kind of infrastructure that allows for an office to work. It can be, actively trying to prime the pump in terms of local economic activity. So when David Petraeus was in Mosul and the start of the Iraq War, he sort of famously was able to help stabilize Mosul by getting the university to open back up and getting sort of services flowing in terms of education and people being sort of busy and active and out. And then he got a tire factory up and running and operating, and so people had jobs and there was local economic activity. That outside actor plays a role in kind of getting those things off the ground, providing some seed capital, providing some security, providing some support, and sort of getting that launched and getting life to return to something that looks like normal can be really helpful. The international community often is involved in assisting with drafting constitutions or reviving legal systems, supporting elections through providing oversight and monitoring, sometimes even running elections. And in some cases, we've seen the United Nations actually function as a caretaker government of in the case of East Timor, while the government is sort of being built up, it's the United Nations that's running sort of the day-to-day administration for a couple of years while that process sort of played out. And so the international community can certainly play a critical role in helping a country transition out of a period of intense violence that eroded state capacity and eroded the economy and eroded the ability to provide services, and get all of that sort of back up and running so that things actually function and remain hopefully stable. And then finally, I'll talk about the role of outside actors in facilitating justice and reconciliation in the wake of conflicts. And this is something that gets a lot of attention to scholarship and ends up being, hotly debated, but also is really important. There's a sense that after conflicts that have been, societally wrenching, in order for peace to really hold, you need some mechanism for the society to deal with the suffering and the trauma that's been experienced. And so in some cases, that's through a truth and reconciliation process, right? And the basic idea is that people who participate in the conflict come forward, they spell out, here are the things that I did, here's how I participated in this conflict, that their accounts are noted, they're integrated into a larger history of the conflict, and that there's sort of a national conversation or a national consensus that emerges out of that truth and reconciliation process. And people who participate, people who share what they did and how they did it, oftentimes get an amnesty or get sort of exempted from any sort of larger consequences for participating in this and providing people some sense of closure of, my uncle went missing in the conflict and nobody knew where he was, but we found out that he was killed in this particular conflict because that truth and reconciliation process played out, and therefore we have some degree of closure on what happened to him, right? That's valuable for people in their individual lives, and there's been dozens of these truth and reconciliation processes that have played out in post-conflict environments, and oftentimes the international community helps support them, right? Maybe it helps in getting them set up, maybe it provides some funding for them, maybe it provides some expertise and support services. That can certainly be part of it. In other situations, in the wake of atrocities and violence and conflicts, you get a more retributive justice where you're trying to prosecute people for crimes against humanity or atrocities or specific war crimes. Sometimes that's done in-house, where you have the prosecution is the state that's carrying that out. Oftentimes when that happens, it's done in conjunction with maybe the United Nations or an international body to provide advising and support, maybe financing for it, even if the state remains sort of the central role in carrying out that sort of justice process. In other cases, it's actually foreign governments that will maybe put people on trial for atrocities. So although it wasn't a Civil War related, Augusto Pinochet was famously put on trial by Spain for crimes committed during his takeover of Chile in the 1970s, and the atrocities that accompanied that coup d'etat. So you can get foreign states actually trying to intervene and provide that justice. And then you can also have the international community through various different tribunals and courts, but now through the International Criminal Court that is prosecuting individuals for crimes against humanity and war crimes. In a very sort of retributive justice kind of way of, we are going to issue arrest warrants, we're going to bring you in, we're going to put you on trial, evidence will be heard, and there'll be a punishment that will be rendered at the end if you're found guilty. And so that model of justice is oftentimes held up as important as a deterrent against future atrocities. It's oftentimes held up as a necessary component of facilitating healing. I think the political science research on that suggests that the healing piece is maybe unclear if that actually holds, but the deterrent effect seems to be there, that particularly when we're looking at transitional justice, where it's dictators being ousted, when there is a process of retributive justice and dictators are put on trial for the crimes that they committed during their rule, that seems to improve the human rights records of neighboring dictators who may be less likely to be horrifically brutal, who are less likely to want to be the sort of next poster child for these kind of trials and prosecutions and justice processes. And so there may be actually a deterrent effect that comes from all of this. Okay, so there are lots of ways in which the international community or states or NGOs play a role in supporting processes of conflict resolution or shaping how these conflicts play out. And as I said, we're going to be digging into some of these in much greater detail, particularly peacekeeping, particularly mediation, and particularly intervention as we talk. Oh, and post-conflict peace building, capacity building over the next couple weeks. But I wanted to kind of lay out sort of the broader story about what's going on so that we can start filling in some of the gaps.